It was a crisp autumn night on November 12, 1964, just shy of midnight, when Harrison Brooks stepped out onto the dimly lit stretch of Lenox Avenue and began his walk south toward 125th Street. The air carried that familiar bite of late fall, the kind that made your breath hang in front of you like a ghost, and the streets were quiet enough that every footstep echoed a little too loudly. Most folks in Harlem were already tucked inside, radios playing low or televisions flickering behind drawn curtains, but Harrison liked these late walks. They gave him time to think, to clear his head after long evenings spent balancing books, settling disputes, and making sure the community he watched over stayed strong. What he didn't let show on his face was that tonight felt different. Tonight, the shadows seemed to stretch a little farther than usual, and the silence carried a weight he recognized all too well. 5 men were trailing him at a careful distance, moving with the practiced coordination of professionals who had done this kind of work before. They wore dark overcoats and kept their hands in their pockets, fingers likely curled around the grips of revolvers. These weren't desperate street kids looking for quick cash or glory. They were seasoned operators, the sort who could make a body vanish so thoroughly that even the sharpest detectives would come up empty. And they had been promised $25,000 to ensure Harrison Brooks never made it home. Vincent Moretti, the calculating head of one of downtown's most powerful families, had issued the contract himself. He had studied Harrison's operation for years, running the numbers again and again until the conclusion was unavoidable. Harrison controlled more than half of the underground gambling revenue across Upper Manhattan, and his influence reached into restaurants, nightclubs, real estate, even City Hall corridors. Taking him out wouldn't just remove a rival, it would crack open a treasure chest that could reshape the entire landscape of organized crime in the city. Vincent prided himself on precision, on understanding every variable. What he failed to account for was the one variable no spreadsheet could ever capture: the depth of loyalty Harrison had built, not through terror, but through something far rarer and far more binding. The plan the hitman followed was textbook clean. Tommy Russo, the team leader, had spent nearly 2 months mapping Harrison's Tuesday night routine. Every week, without fail, Harrison would leave a community center near 135th Street around 11:30, stroll alone down Lenox Avenue, pause briefly at a newsstand or greet a late-night vendor, then hail a cab near 125th. The window of exposure lasted roughly 8 minutes, long enough for a coordinated strike, short enough to minimize witnesses. 3 escape routes had been plotted. 2 getaway cars idled nearby with drivers ready, and the hour ensured the streets would be mostly deserted. Tommy felt confident as he closed the distance, raising his .38 special for the first shot. But Harrison Brooks had never been a creature of true routine. What looked like predictable habit from the outside was actually deliberate variation masked as pattern. He changed small details every week: the exact exit time, the side of the street he favored, the occasional detour through a side alley, just enough to keep observers guessing while still appearing consistent to anyone watching from afar. More importantly, Harrison had built something the downtown families had never quite grasped: a living, breathing, early warning system woven through the very fabric of Harlem. Information moved through the neighborhood not by telephone or runner, but by glances exchanged on stoops, nods between shopkeepers, whispers passed along by kids playing late games of tag. Grandmothers rocking on porches saw everything. Barbers sweeping their sidewalks at closing time noticed unfamiliar cars. Delivery drivers clocked strangers lingering too long. By 10:15 that evening, word had already rippled through Harrison's network that 5 out-of-place men in nice coats were positioning themselves along Lenox Avenue. Harrison knew he was being hunted long before the first footstep fell behind him. The question wasn't survival. It was what kind of statement he wanted to make with it. High above the street, 17-year-old Marcus Tate crouched on a fire escape, heart pounding but instructions clear: watch for trouble, signal only if real police showed up, then melt away. Marcus had been running errands for Harrison since the spring, delivering envelopes, collecting policy slips, learning the value of discretion. From his perch he spotted the 5 men fanning out in textbook formation and felt ice run through his veins. He thought he was about to witness the end of the man who had quietly paid for his mother's hospital stay last winter and slipped him $20 for school clothes without ever asking for thanks. What Marcus didn't yet understand was that he was about to witness something far more instructive than violence. The first shot rang out at 11:53 p.m., aimed to enter just behind Harrison's left ear. Instead, it shattered the plate glass window of a nearby dry cleaner, showering the sidewalk with glittering shards. Harrison had dropped low and rolled smoothly behind a parked Chevrolet, moving with a grace that belied his age. He hadn't heard the shot coming. He hadn't needed to. He had felt the shift in the night, the way conversations on stoops suddenly hushed, the way curtains twitched in unison. Harlem itself had warned him. Tommy Russo's second shot went wild when a series of sharp cracks exploded near his feet. He spun to see sparks and smoke rising from an overturned trash can, then caught a fleeting glimpse of a small figure vanishing over a rooftop edge. 12-year-old Jerome Hayes had been perched up there since dusk, armed with a slingshot and a pocket full of leftover firecrackers from summer celebrations. His orders had been simple. When the moment felt right, make noise, sow chaos, then run like hell. Jerome executed them perfectly, and by the time Tommy reoriented, the street had come alive in ways no one downtown could have predicted. Sirens began wailing from multiple directions, sharp, insistent, converging. Tommy's team hesitated, scanning for patrol cars that never appeared. Those sirens belonged to vehicles owned by friends of Harrison's network, an ambulance from a private service on 128th, a couple of taxis with modified horns, the panel van from a neighborhood auto shop rigged with an old police siren for emergencies. They weren't coming to arrest anyone. They were coming to amplify confusion, to turn a quiet assassination into a very public spectacle. Within moments, residents began stepping out of doorways and descending fire escapes, not with weapons drawn, but with the calm curiosity of people responding to neighborhood noise. Men in robes, women wrapping coats over nightgowns, teenagers pretending they'd been outside all along. No one shouted threats. No one rushed the gunmen. They simply appeared, dozens of them, forming loose clusters that blocked sight lines and escape paths without ever seeming aggressive. The street filled with conversation, laughter, even someone calling out about a late night card game. To an outsider it looked like spontaneous community spirit. To the 5 hitmen it felt like being swallowed by quicksand. Harrison rose slowly from cover, straightening his overcoat and adjusting his fedora, as if he'd merely paused to tie a shoe. He looked directly at Tommy Russo, who still gripped his smoking revolver, face pale beneath the street lamp glow. The other 4 gunmen shifted uncertainly, weapons half raised but no clear shot available through the growing crowd. Harrison's voice cut through the night air, quiet but carrying effortlessly. "Evening, gentlemen. You seem a little turned around. Can I help you find your way?" Those simple words landed like a judge's gavel. Every resident nearby heard the subtext. The game was over, the trap sprung, and the hunters had become the hunted. Tommy opened his mouth, closed it again, unsure whether to shoot, run, or simply stand there while the world tilted. No further shots were fired. Within minutes the fake sirens faded, the crowd began dispersing as naturally as it had gathered, and the 5 men found themselves alone on the sidewalk with Harrison Brooks, standing 10 feet away, hands visible, expression almost kindly. He didn't threaten them. He didn't need to. He simply invited them to step into a nearby all-night diner that happened to be open, offering coffee and a chance to talk privately. They went. Because at that moment, refusing felt far more dangerous than accepting. Inside the diner, under fluorescent lights and the watchful but discreet gaze of the counterman, Harrison spoke calmly for nearly an hour. He knew each man's name, their family situations, their debts and dreams and pressures. He laid out offers tailored to each: relocation money, legitimate job connections in other cities, medical care for sick relatives, loan forgiveness from certain creditors, college funds for children. No threats, no ultimatums. Just possibilities they had never believed were within reach. Tommy Russo had a wife facing expensive treatments and 3 young daughters who barely saw their father. Harrison offered a construction partnership in Philadelphia with steady contracts already lined up. Eddie Mancini carried gambling debts that had put his family in real danger. Harrison promised those markers would vanish and a restaurant opportunity would appear in Cleveland. Vincent Caruso's aging parents needed care his salary couldn't cover. Harrison outlined a film industry contact in California who owed him favors. The other 2 received similar paths out: clean starts, real money, safety for their loved ones. They listened. They asked questions. They weighed the impossible choice between the man who had sent them to kill and the man who was now offering to save them from the lives that had driven them to accept the contract in the first place. One by one, they chose the second option. Over the following weeks, the 5 men quietly left New York. Their families received anonymous assistance that covered medical bills, tuition, mortgages. New businesses opened in their names in distant cities. Old debts evaporated. And every year around the holidays, plain envelopes arrived at a certain Harlem address containing thank you notes and updated family photos. No return addresses, just quiet gratitude. Vincent Moretti never learned exactly what happened to his hired team. Official reports spoke of desertions, nervous breakdowns, sudden relocations. Unofficially, his organization began hemorrhaging talent. Mid-level operators, enforcers, even a few captains quietly approached Harrison's people seeking better arrangements. Within a year, expansion plans north of 110th Street were shelved indefinitely. Within 2 years, Vincent himself requested a sit-down to discuss mutual non-aggression, a conversation that ended with him acknowledging boundaries he had once intended to erase. Marcus Tate, the teenager on the fire escape, watched the entire scene unfold and carried its lesson into adulthood. He built a successful importing business, employed dozens from the neighborhood, funded scholarships, and never forgot how one man turned certain death into widespread life. Jerome Hayes grew into a respected community advocate and youth mentor, teaching kids that courage sometimes looks like firecrackers in the dark and perfect timing. The men who provided the sirens kept their shops and families thriving, occasionally testing their equipment on quiet nights just to keep the memory sharp. Harrison Brooks continued his late walks, varying routes and times, always alone but never truly alone. The neighborhood watched over him the way he watched over it, a mutual bond forged not in fear, but in countless quiet acts of care. He never raised his voice about that November night. He didn't need to. The story spread anyway, growing with each retelling, becoming legend. The night 5 professional killers came for Harlem's quiet king and left as allies carrying better futures in their pockets. Years later, when younger men asked how he had managed to survive impossible odds, Harrison would smile faintly and say something simple. Real power isn't measured by how many people you can hurt. It's measured by how many you can help, even the ones sent to hurt you. That understanding reshaped more than just underworld boundaries. It reminded an entire generation that leadership isn't about domination, it's about elevation. That strength sometimes means absorbing an attack without returning it in kind. That the greatest victories are the ones where everyone walks away better than they arrived. On that cold November night in 1964, 5 men set out to end a life and instead discovered a different path forward. One man walked away having done something far more profound than merely surviving. He proved that even in the darkest corners, redemption is possible if someone is willing to offer it. And in doing so, he didn't just protect his community, he expanded the very definition of what community could mean. The ripples continued long after the footsteps faded. Young people growing up in Harlem heard versions of the story and internalized its core truth. Loyalty earned through generosity outlasts loyalty bought through intimidation. Businesses flourished under fair protection rather than exploitative control. Kids who might have followed destructive paths found doors opened instead, trade apprenticeships, college funds, mentorships. Harrison never sought credit. He simply kept building, kept listening, kept choosing the harder but better way. Vincent Moretti, in his later years, reportedly told close associates that the smartest move he ever made was deciding not to make another move against Harrison Brooks. He had seen empires rise on fear and crumble just as quickly. He had watched one man build something more durable on respect, and even he couldn't help but acknowledge the difference. Marcus Tate eventually sat on community boards and quietly funded programs that kept kids off corners and in classrooms. Jerome Hayes coached Little League and spoke in schools about courage and quick thinking. The families of those 5 relocated men sent their children to universities, built homes, lived lives unshadowed by past choices. And Harrison Brooks kept walking those Harlem streets at night, hat tilted just so, coat buttoned against the chill, carrying himself with the calm assurance of someone who understood that true safety doesn't come from walls or weapons. It comes from the knowledge that the people around you would sooner move mountains than let harm come your way, and that you would do the same for them. That's the legacy of one quiet evening when gunfire echoed and then fell silent, when threats dissolved into conversation, when death was turned away at the door and hope was invited in instead. It's the story of how a community protected its own not by destroying outsiders, but by showing them a better road. It's the reminder that even in a world that often feels ruled by force, there is always room for a different kind of strength, the kind that lifts rather than crushes, that transforms rather than eliminates, that chooses possibility over punishment. That night didn't just save one man's life. It demonstrated what real power looks like when it decides to build instead of break. And in the decades that followed, countless people, some who knew the full story, many who only felt its effects, lived better lives because one man facing 5 guns in the dark chose to offer 5 futures instead of 5 graves.